Hi, I am April. I am 35 years old. When my mother died, the world got quieter. Not the kind of quiet you notice right away, but the kind that creeps in and settles into the corners of your home. It was as if her laughter had been stitched into the walls of our childhood house, and when she left, the stitching came undone. My father, once a man of careful routine and stubborn pride, began to change in ways I wasn't prepared for. He was a Vietnam veteran, tough in his own way, and perhaps even more so after Mom passed. But the toughness was brittle now. His sharpness dulled, not with age but with grief. I watched it happen like slow erosion, a man shrinking into himself, into his past, and eventually into a place I could no longer follow. After the funeral, he tried to stay in the house, tried to cling to the familiar, but the silence was too loud there. A year later, he sold our childhood home. It was an old two-story house with faded blue siding and flower boxes that hadn't seen tulips since before Mom got sick. He used to care for that place with near military precision. Now, I think it reminded him of everything he lost. I didn't blame him for leaving, even though the sale of that house felt like the last thread tying us to the people we were before the silence set in. He moved into an independent living facility on the other side of town. It wasn't far, maybe 15 minutes from my place, but it might as well have been another country. He had a small apartment there, a kitchenette, and a balcony that overlooked a man-made pond. The place was clean and quiet. Too quiet, maybe. He didn't complain, at least not at first. He tried to adjust, but the space was sterile, like the air in hospitals, and it lacked the warmth of a home. I visited every Sunday, brought him groceries, adjusted his thermostat, and helped him with apps on his phone. He didn't need full-time care, but I could tell he was slipping, not just physically, though the tremor in his right hand had gotten worse, but emotionally too. He had these faraway moments, like something from the war had taken up permanent residence in his mind. It got worse in the fall. He had what the doctors called a PTSD episode. I just called it terrifying. He ended up in the hospital for a week. Afterwards, he stopped sleeping through the night and lost interest in his usual routines. The staff at the facility were kind but distant. He was just another resident to them. And I was his daughter, but I was also a single woman juggling 2 part-time jobs and a sense of guilt that never left me. Then came the shift. I didn't notice until it was too late. A few weeks ago, he mentioned needing to go to the bank. That alone was strange. He hadn't stepped into a physical bank in years. He handled everything through his phone and kept things digital and secure, as he liked to say. When I asked why, he brushed me off. He said he needed to update something with his direct deposit. His voice was calm, but his eyes had that telltale flicker of defensiveness. I should have pressed harder. I should have followed him, but I didn't. I let it go. The truth came out 2 weeks later, during what was supposed to be a normal visit. I was helping him set up his Hulu account. He couldn't remember the password and got frustrated, so I offered to take care of it. I was holding his phone to receive the security code when I saw the messages. They weren't hidden. He wasn't trying to hide them. That somehow made it worse. There were dozens, no, hundreds of messages from a woman named Claire. I don't know why that name struck me as artificial. Maybe because I'd never heard him mention her, not even once. Maybe because the pictures she sent didn't look like someone who would know how to have a conversation with my dad, let alone fall in love with him. She looked 25 at most. Her selfies were overposed, the kind of filtered beauty you only see in manipulated Instagram profiles. I scrolled. The messages were overly affectionate, filled with praise and promises. Love notes that didn't sound like they came from a real person. And then I saw the photos he'd sent in return. His driver's license, his social security card, a picture of a check. Front and back, I remember my stomach dropping. Not a metaphorical drop, a physical, nauseating freefall. When he went to the bathroom, I kept scrolling. Credit card information, bank account numbers, pictures of forms, everything she would need to become him, or at least empty him out. My hands were shaking when he came back. I didn't even think about how I would approach it. I just looked up and asked him what was going on. He looked confused at first, then closed off. He said Claire was in London. She was finishing something with an inheritance. They were going to be together. She just needed help to get out of a legal situation. But once she was free, they'd be together forever. She promised. I told him it was a scam. I explained how these things worked, how people use AI tools now to make their lies more convincing. I reverse image searched her photos, showed him the identical results on multiple other fake profiles. He looked and nodded, but something in him didn't bend, like his heart refused to accept what his eyes could see. When I asked him how much he'd sent, his answers came in increments. First, it was $5,000, then $20,000. Then he said, half his money. I already knew it was more than that. The money from the house sale had been his safety net. It was everything he had beyond Social Security and the VABL. That money was supposed to carry him through the rest of his life. A cushion, a comfort, a silent promise that he wouldn't have to worry again. Gone. I told him we needed to call the bank, alert the authorities, and freeze his credit. I told him we had to get my sister involved. She was his power of attorney and that we couldn't wait. At first, he agreed. He let me take his phone. He said he was tired anyway. I left that day thinking it would all start to resolve, that we would figure it out together. I was so wrong. Later that evening, my sister and I went through everything on his phone. Every message, every account, every app. It was worse than I imagined. He hadn't just sent money, he had opened new accounts, responded to prompts to sign up for credit cards, and redirected his benefits. There were accounts in his name we had never seen before, balances drawn down to nothing. Some cards maxed out. Others had suspicious payments to overseas vendors. There were money wire apps installed we'd never seen before. She had taken everything. Whoever this Claire really was, she had drained him like it was her profession, and maybe it was. We were still sitting in stunned silence when the doorbell rang. My father had driven over. He never drives at night, but there he was, standing in the entryway, demanding his phone. I wanted to tell him everything we found. I wanted to make him understand, but he wouldn't listen. All he cared about was getting the phone back. He said he needed to talk to Claire, that she was scared, that she was waiting for him, that we didn't understand. I tried reasoning. So did my sister, but the moment shifted like a storm coming in too fast. His anger arrived, like a wave. He blamed me for ruining his dinner, for interfering, and for treating him like a child. Then he screamed at my sister. I'd never heard him scream like that before. Not even during the worst nights after Mom died, the kids heard. My niece was crying. My brother-in-law stepped in and told him to leave. Told him not to come back until he could speak like a human being. My dad refused, said we were brainwashed, said we were cruel. I grabbed his arm and pushed him toward the door. I gave him the phone. I told him to leave. He walked into the night, clutching that device like it was a lifeline. I didn't see a man. I saw a hollowed-out version of someone I used to admire. Someone who had once held me in his arms and promised to protect me from everything. I sat on my porch for hours that night. Just sat there, watching the moon trace its path across the sky, listening to the quiet hum of the neighborhood. I thought about what he had lost, what we had all lost. I thought about how a stranger with a fake smile and a templated story could take a man's dignity, his savings, and his sanity, and I thought about my mother, how I wished more than anything she was still here. The morning after everything exploded felt unreal, like waking up in a version of my life that had been cracked open and hollowed out overnight. I stood in my kitchen staring at a cup of coffee that had gone cold before I could bring it to my lips. My hands trembled, not from fear, not from anger, from helplessness. I couldn't stop replaying the scene in my sister's living room. My father's face twisted in frustration, confusion, and betrayal. His voice rose from sharp annoyance to volcanic rage. The way my niece's eyes filled with tears as the shouting grew louder. The sound of the front door slamming behind him still echoed in my chest. I had always known he was proud, stubborn, set in his ways, but I never thought I'd see him turn on us like that. I had tried to help him. I thought I was saving him from something, but maybe I had only dragged him further into the dark. I left the cold coffee on the counter and drove to my sister's house. The roads were empty. It was early. It was too early for anyone to know that our father had been gutted by a scammer. It's too early for the world to offer any solutions. She was already up. Her face looked like mine, swollen from lack of sleep, pale with dread. We sat at her dining table, surrounded by the mess from the night before. Printouts, bank statements, screenshots, a graveyard of evidence. She had spent most of the night freezing what accounts she could, filing reports, locking credit cards, placing alerts with the major credit bureaus. She spoke quietly, like she was trying not to wake the children upstairs. Or maybe like saying it louder would make it more real. Most of the money was unrecoverable. It had vanished into a labyrinth of fake names, shell accounts, and international wire transfers. The largest sum of wire for nearly $40,000 had cleared 10 days earlier. The rest were in increments, small withdrawals that seemed innocent on the surface but together formed a pattern of slow decay. We went through the messages. Again, Claire's tone had shifted subtly over time. In the beginning, she was flirtatious, full of compliments and attention. Then came the vulnerability. They invented legal issues. The inheritance is tied up by bureaucracy, the fake lawyers, the forged documents. It was an elaborate script, and my father had followed it line by line. He had shared everything: his documents, his passwords, his life story. He had confessed things to her that he hadn't told us in years. Fears about growing old, memories of war, loneliness, regret. She had listened, or pretended to. She had made him feel seen. And in return, he gave her everything he had. I felt sick. We went to the bank that afternoon. The manager was polite but defeated. They had seen this before, dozens of times. Older people are targeted through Facebook or Instagram or messaging apps. Romance scams that fed off isolation and hope. It was always the same story. The person was never real. The money was never coming back. He told us what we already knew. There would be investigations, but little chance of justice. The scammers operated across borders, behind digital curtains that law enforcement rarely pierced. We went to the police station next, filed a report, handed over the screenshots. The officer was patient, took notes, and said they would pass it along to the financial crimes unit. But her tone carried the same weary undertone as the bank manager, a kind of professional resignation. They were swimming against a tide that never stopped rising. By the time we returned to my sister's house, the kids were home from school. My niece ran up to me and asked if Grandpa was still mad. I lied and told her no, that he was just tired, that everything would be okay, but I didn't believe it. He didn't call that night. He didn't call the next day either. I thought maybe he had realized something. Maybe the silence meant he was waking up from the fog, but it wasn't that. It was something worse. On the third day, the facility called. He had missed a medication check, then a meal, then a scheduled wellness visit. They had tried knocking, no response. They entered with the spare key and found him sitting in the dark, clutching his phone like it was the last piece of himself he could hold on to. He hadn't eaten. He hadn't slept. He had spent 2 days scrolling through his messages with Claire, reading and rereading her promises, her I love yous, her reassurances that they would be together soon. He refused to let the staff touch the phone. He kept saying she was close, that any minute now, she would call and explain everything. They called me because he wouldn't let anyone else in. I drove over, not knowing what to expect. What I found was worse than I had imagined. His apartment smelled stale. The blinds were drawn. There were tissues crumpled across the floor and food rotting on a plate by the sink. He looked thinner. His hands trembled more than usual. But it was his eyes that scared me. Hollow and wild, like someone trying to hold on to a reality that no longer existed. I sat down beside him and didn't say anything for a while. Just sat there and listened to the silence. He didn't speak either, just stared at the screen, waiting. Eventually, I asked him to come with me, to get some fresh air, maybe go for a walk. He refused. She said she would call soon, that he needed to stay close to the Wi-Fi. I told him the money was gone. He said money didn't matter, that love was more important, that this was real. I felt something inside me break. I wanted to scream, to shake him, to demand he look at what he had done. But I didn't, because this wasn't just about money. This was about a man who had lost his wife, his purpose, and his sense of being needed. This was about a heart that had been left unattended for too long and now had latched onto a fantasy so deeply it had become his only anchor. I called my sister. We made a plan. He couldn't stay in the facility, not without money, not without some kind of intervention. She would contact the VA and see if there were programs for veterans in crisis. I would look into adult protective services, not because I wanted to strip him of control, but because someone had to do something. He was spiraling, and we couldn't let him fall any further. That night, I sat in my car for a long time before driving home. The sky was overcast, and the streetlights flickered like tired eyes. I felt a hollowness I couldn't name, a sense that something had been lost, not just the money or the security, but something intangible, something like trust, like the belief that the people you love will always know when to reach for help. The next morning, I called every number I could find. The VABL, legal aid, senior services. Most places were sympathetic but overworked. There were wait lists, paperwork, evaluations. I filled out what I could, sent emails, and left messages. My father didn't answer my calls. When I returned to his apartment 2 days later, it was cleaner. The blinds were open, the lights were on, but he was the same. His hands still clutched the phone. His eyes still searched the screen. I noticed something new though. A message at the top of the app.it said the user was no longer available. I don't know what happened. Maybe the scammer had moved on. Maybe the fake account had been flagged. Maybe she had gotten everything she wanted and disappeared, like smoke. He didn't understand. He thought she had been kidnapped, that something had gone wrong. He asked me to help him find her. He begged. I told him again. It wasn't real. None of it was real. He didn't cry, but something in his face shifted, like a door finally creaking open. He asked me if I was sure. I said yes. He put the phone down. I didn't know what would happen next. I still don't, but for the first time in weeks, he looked at me, really looked, and in that moment, I saw a flicker of the man I used to know, worn down, broken, but still there, still my father. Grief doesn't always begin with a death. Sometimes it begins with a realization so quiet it almost feels like mercy. That's what I learned the day my father finally put the phone down. It was a small movement, almost nothing, but it carried the weight of months, maybe years of pain. His hand, trembling as always, rested the device gently on the coffee table. The screen went black. Silence settled into the room like fresh snow. Cold, still, familiar. For a moment, I didn't speak. I was afraid to break it, that fragile silence. I thought if I moved too quickly, he might change his mind, pick it back up, slip into the illusion again. But he didn't. He just sat there, his hands folded in his lap, his gaze fixed somewhere far away. The phone remained untouched. That night, I stayed with him. I made tea even though he didn't ask for it. I opened the windows and let the breeze drift in. The autumn air was cool and sharp. The scent of dying leaves and distant fires filled the apartment. I sat on the couch across from him while the wind fluttered the curtains, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something that resembled peace. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. His silence spoke for him. The next morning, I drove home, feeling both lighter and heavier at once. Lighter because he had let go of something that was killing him. He had faced the void and stepped away. He had stopped chasing a lie. but heavier because I knew what came next would not be simple. Healing never is. In the days that followed, I focused on structure. I made lists, called offices, collected documents. I learned the language of crisis management, fraud alerts, benefit holds, affidavit submissions, and elder protective services intake forms. Each word was another brick in the wall I was trying to build around my father. A wall to keep the world from hurting him again. Or maybe just to make myself feel useful. My sister and I divided the tasks. She dealt with the legal end power of attorney adjustments, letters to creditors, and documentation for the VABL. I handled the emotional wreckage. I sat with him every other day, listened when he spoke and when he didn't. I brought groceries, tidied his place, read aloud from books he used to love. I tried to reintroduce him to his own life, 1 hour at a time. He was quieter than ever, not angry anymore, just tired. There was a weight in his eyes that hadn't been there before, a kind of bruised understanding. He no longer defended her. He no longer insisted she would return. But he didn't talk about her either. Her name had become a wound neither of us wanted to reopen. He asked me once if I thought he was stupid. I told him no, but I didn't say what I wanted to say, that it wasn't about intelligence, that the strongest hearts are often the most vulnerable, that loneliness is a kind of hunger, and when someone finally offers you warmth, you don't always stop to ask whether it's real. You just open the door and let them in, even if it means losing everything. Instead, I just squeezed his hand and told him he wasn't alone. He nodded, but I could tell he didn't quite believe it yet. The financial fallout was still unraveling. We learned more each week. A credit card we hadn't seen, a utility account, was opened in his name in another state. Payments he couldn't explain. A fraudulent auto loan. His Social Security deposits had been redirected to a third-party bank account that was now closed. Tracing everything felt like chasing ghosts through smoke. The professionals tried their best, but we knew recovery would be limited. Most of the stolen funds were unrecoverable, vanished into a web of digital laundering and dead-end transfers. Every call to a fraud department felt the same: long holds, polite apologies, and nothing they could do. It was like trying to refill a glass that had already been shattered, but we did what we could. We consolidated what remained, applied for emergency housing assistance through the VABL, moved him to a smaller unit in the facility with a subsidized plan, filed claims with every agency we could find. It wasn't enough to restore everything, but it was enough to keep him afloat, barely. There were moments that gave me hope. Small ones, like the time I found him in the community garden trimming back the rose bushes. He hadn't touched a garden since Mom died. Or the day he asked me to bring his old journals, the ones he used to write in during long winters when he couldn't sleep. He didn't read them at first. He just held them in his lap, running his fingers along the spine. But that was something. A reaching, a remembering. I found my own moments of stillness too. Long walks in the evening, turning off my phone, cooking from scratch again. I started painting again, something I hadn't done since college. Not because I wanted to make anything good, but because putting color on canvas felt like reclaiming space in my own life. The trauma had taken something from all of us, not just my father. There was a fracture between us now, a subtle one, not born from blame, but from the reality that he had believed someone else's love over mine, that he had chosen a phantom over the family who had never left. I didn't hate him for it, but I hadn't yet forgiven him either. I didn't know if I ever fully would. Forgiveness, I was learning, is not always a decision. Sometimes it's a process you endure. Like rain on a long drive, you don't control when it starts. You don't decide when it stops. You just keep your hands on the wheel and hope the road stays visible. There were days when I resented how much space the pain took up, how it seeped into every conversation, every memory, every plan. There were days when I thought about cutting contact, not because I didn't love him, but because I didn't know how to carry both his grief and mine without breaking. But then I would remember the way he looked at Mom in her final weeks, The way he read to her even when she couldn't answer. The way he memorized every line of her favorite poem just so she could hear it one more time, even if only in dreams. That version of him still lived somewhere inside the wreckage. I owed it to both of us to keep looking. One night, several months after it all began, he called me. It was late. I had been sleeping. I answered with my heart pounding, fearing something had gone wrong. But his voice was calm, clear. He said he just wanted to say thank you. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. It was the first time since my mother died that he had reached out without being prompted. The first time he had acknowledged the toll this had taken. It wasn't a solution. It wasn't redemption, but it was real, and after so many months of lies, real was enough. Winter arrived slower than usual that year, as if the seasons were reluctant to shift while our lives still hung in limbo. The leaves took their time falling, and the cold crept in through the edges of days instead of bursting in all at once. There was something poetic in that, as though the world understood we needed gentleness now. A slow descent, not another storm. After that late-night phone call, my father didn't call again for a while. But something had changed. He started showing up, not perfectly, not consistently, but enough. He joined the weekly support group at the facility. It was for veterans dealing with late-onset PTSD and emotional isolation. He never would have gone before. Pride wouldn't have allowed it. But now, his pride had taken its own kind of loss, and in that empty space, something new had begun to grow. Maybe humility, maybe just exhaustion. Either way, he was showing up. I started visiting him every Friday. We created a routine. I brought soup or something simple. He made coffee. We played cards, watched old movies, or just sat in silence. Sometimes, he told me stories from before I was born. Stories I had never heard before. About the war. About Mom. About mistakes he had made long before anyone ever thought of scamming old men through phones. It wasn't comfortable, but it was real. I think that mattered more than anything else. There were still days when the shadows crept in. Days when he stared at the wall too long. When he asked aloud questions that had no answers. What if she had been real? What if he hadn't sold the house? What if Mom had lived longer? What if I had just needed someone to talk to? I never tried to answer those questions. I just let them drift through the air and dissolve. I had my own shadows to manage. There were nights when I lay in bed thinking about all the ways things could have gone differently. If I had checked his phone sooner, if I had visited more often, if I had never let him walk out of that house with the money from the sale. Guilt has a way of curling up beside you like a second skin. It doesn't shout, it whispers, and it never runs out of things to say, but with time, the whispers grew fainter. One Saturday in January, I found him painting. He had set up a small table in the corner of his living room, covered it with newspaper, and was working with a set of cheap watercolors. The brush trembled in his hand, but the paper was filled with streaks of color blues and greens mostly. They weren't good by any artistic standard, but they were vivid, alive. He said he just wanted to see what would happen if he made something again. I told him that was enough. I brought my own sketchpad the following week. We didn't talk much, just painted. I hadn't realized how much I had missed creating. My lines were messy, my color sense was rusty, but I didn't care. We shared that silence like two people trying to stitch something back together, not the past. That was gone, but the present. The world outside kept moving. Taxes needed filing. My car needed repairs. My sister's kids got the flu. Life continued its quiet forward crawl. But every time I saw him now, I saw less of the man who had collapsed under delusion and more of the man I remembered from years before. Still changed, still wounded, but upright. We never talked about Claire again. Not directly. Once, he asked if the police had ever found anything. I told him no. He nodded and said he didn't think they would. That was all. No tears, no anger, just that. He had accepted it in a way I hadn't expected. Spring came earlier than usual. The snow melted faster. The air lost its bitterness. Flowers started blooming outside the entrance to his facility, and the garden beds filled with new life. He signed up to volunteer for the planting crew, woke up early on Wednesdays just to carry bags of soil and talk with other residents. I found out from the staff, not from him. When I asked why he hadn't mentioned it, he just shrugged and said he wanted to try being useful again. That stayed with me. I realized how deeply that scam had attacked something far greater than his bank account. It had attacked his dignity, his sense of being valuable, needed, loved. That woman or whoever had pretended to be her had spoken to the most fragile part of him, the part that feared he had already lived the best parts of his life and was now just waiting for the end. What she stole was more than money, but what he was rebuilding slowly, painstakingly, was something she could never touch. One day, I brought him an envelope filled with old photographs. I had found them while going through storage. Pictures of him and Mom in the early years, beach trips, holidays, a few of me as a baby in his arms. He spent hours going through them, smiling, crying too. I didn't say much. I let him feel what he needed to feel. Later, he told me he wished he had loved us louder when we were younger. I told him I had always known he loved us, that it just took me longer to understand how he showed it. That moment stayed with me for a long time. Forgiveness arrived slowly, not in a single sweeping moment, but in quiet realizations like that, little flashes of truth that softened the sharp edges. I still carried some of the pain. I probably always would, but I stopped letting it define the way I looked at him. He was still my father. He had made a terrible mistake, but he was trying to find his way back, and in doing so, he was giving me permission to do the same. We were not the same people we had been a year ago. The house was gone. The money was gone. The illusion of safety had been stripped away. But something else had emerged from the wreckage, a new kind of closeness. It wasn't perfect. It was quiet and awkward and occasionally fragile, but it was real, and after everything we had lost, that was enough. That had to be enough. There are certain weights we carry so long that we forget what life feels like without them. Guilt is one of them. Grief is another. I had grown used to both. They lived in me, subtle and heavy, like stones stitched into my chest. Not always visible, but always there. It had been almost a year since we discovered the scam. The anniversaries of things started to pass quietly. The day he met her, the day I found the messages, the day he lost everything. They marked themselves without fanfare. I felt them like shifts in the air, like echoes in my ribs. But there was something else now too, light, not all the time, not constant, but present. My father had begun smiling again. Not the kind he used to fake for nurses or neighbors, not the thin one he wore at holidays because it was expected. Real smiles, ones that started in his eyes and reached his mouth naturally. He laughed more. He called more often, sometimes just to tell me what he had for lunch or what book he had checked out from the library. He was building a life again, a smaller life, quieter, but his. I had built something too, a kind of sanctuary, not physical, not anything you could see or measure, just the space inside me where I no longer resented him, where I no longer asked why he hadn't believed me sooner or why he had thrown everything away for someone who never existed. He had been lonely, and I understood loneliness better now than I ever had. I had spent so much of the last year caring for him that I hadn't really stopped to care for myself. It caught up with me slowly, in small ways. My sleep suffered, my paintings lost color, I forgot birthdays and left messages unanswered. I realized that healing someone else had distracted me from tending my own wounds. So I started therapy. At first, I told no one, not even my sister. It felt too personal to tangled, but with each session, I peeled back layers I hadn't realized were still clinging to me. I talked about my mother, about the way I had felt invisible as a teenager, about how hard I had worked to keep everything together after she died, how exhausted I was from always being the responsible one, the calm one, the fixer, I told the therapist how much I hated the person who stole from my father, but also how much I envied what she gave him. The illusion of love, the attention, the comfort. I admitted that I had failed to see how deeply he was unraveling, and I forgave myself for not being enough to stop it. I began painting again, but differently, not to fix anything, not to create something beautiful, just to feel what it felt like to move color across canvas, to let things be messy, unfinished, honest. One of my pieces ended up in a local community show. My father came to see it. He wore a tie I hadn't seen in years, slightly crooked, and carried a tiny notebook where he had written a few sentences about what the painting made him feel. I never read them. I just watched his hand rest on the paper like it held something precious. We went out for coffee afterward, sat outside even though it was still cold. He didn't talk about the past. He didn't talk about the scam. He just talked about the people in his group, about a new neighbor who played guitar, about how he was thinking of getting a small dog. He sounded hopeful. It was such a foreign tone in his voice that I almost didn't recognize it. Hopefulness had been absent for so long that hearing it again felt like witnessing a sunrise after endless rain. That night, I thought about how many people lose themselves slowly, not in one dramatic collapse, but in a series of small decisions, little surrenders. Compromises are made in silence, and how easy it is to mistake connection for love when you've been without either for too long. I no longer hated the person who scammed him. I pitied them, because what they had taken was tangible, temporary, but what my father had now was something they could never have: a daughter who still showed up, a life rebuilt, a second chance. The last frost came in April. Fitting, I suppose, the kind of poetic coincidence I used to roll my eyes at. But now I've learned that life doesn't always speak plainly. Sometimes it leaves small symbols, like breadcrumbs. Sometimes the seasons echo what's happening inside you, and you either notice or you don't. That frost was light, a shimmer over rooftops and grass blades. It melted quickly, forgotten by midday, but I noticed it. I stood by my kitchen window with my hands around a mug and watched the silver vanish in the light. It felt like a quiet farewell to something I hadn't fully named, a chapter closing. That spring, my father adopted a dog from the local shelter, a small terrier mix with weary hair and nervous eyes. He named her Daisy, not for any reason, he explained. Maybe because she looked fragile, maybe because he wanted something simple and kind in his life. She changed everything. Suddenly, he had responsibility again, something living to care for, something that needed him, expected things from him, and greeted him when he came home. He began walking again, longer distances, slower paces. He spoke to neighbors, smiled at strangers, let the world back in. I saw him differently after that, not as someone I needed to guard constantly, not as someone broken beyond repair, but as someone learning how to belong again, to himself, to the world, to us. We talked more, not about the past, not about Claire, but about books, about food, about childhood memories we'd both stored away like keepsakes. One day, he told me about the first time he held me in the hospital and how terrified he had been that he would drop me, how he had whispered to me that he would never let anything hurt me. He didn't cry when he said it, neither did I, but something passed between us then, heavier than grief and lighter than forgiveness, a kind of understanding. Not everything had gone the way he promised it would, but he had tried. Even now, he was trying. We started meeting at the park on Sundays. He'd bring Daisy, I'd bring coffee. We'd sit by the pond where ducks gathered and talk about nothing important. Sometimes we didn't talk at all, just sat, letting time pass without urgency. I think that's what healing really is, not some triumphant transformation, not some clean slate, just two people learning how to sit with what's left and be okay with it. One Sunday, months later, he handed me a small envelope. Inside was a photo of my mother I'd never seen. She was laughing, one hand shielding her eyes from the sun, the other holding a cone of ice cream. He said he found it in an old wallet and thought I should have it. I kept it on my nightstand for weeks. I still look at it when I can't sleep. He has stopped asking about the money. He no longer watches his phone like it might spring back to life. The name Claire is gone from his vocabulary, like a dream you remember only by feeling, not by shape. He has begun writing again. Short journal entries, notes about Daisy, fragments of memory. He says it helps him stay present. That some days, staying present is the hardest work of all. I believe him, and I've changed too. I don't check his accounts anymore. I don't hover. I let him live. I let myself live. I've stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop. Because I've learned something else. The worst already did, and we're still here, not untouched. Not whole in the way we once were, but held together by something stronger than fear, stronger than shame. We are held together by the quiet resilience that builds when you've walked through fire and found each other on the other side. The story doesn't end in justice. The scammer was never caught. The money was never returned. No dramatic apology arrived in the mail. There was no courtroom, no final confrontation, just silence where a lie once lived. But we got something else. We got truth. We got a second chance. We got each other, and sometimes that's more than enough. Thanks for listening to my story. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video for more scam stories.